and the Executive Director of Boys and Girls Clubs Big Brothers Big Sisters of Edmonton and area. She's an amazing champion of mentoring and is actively involved in conversations shaping the future of this field at all levels, starting in her neighborhood and extending to municipal, provincial, and nationwide conversations. So thank you for being with us this morning, Liz. Over to you.
Thanks, Rochelle, very much. And I'd like to just acknowledge that Carolyn is here from the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and Tanya, who you just met, and Rochelle, who you met, and Megan is here, and Andy is here. And I think the only person who might not be here is Ananya from Calgary.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here? Okay,
Yep.
wonderful. This wonderful team of people are the steps. Some of them are lent to us. For example, Rochelle and Megan are lent to us from the Alberta government to support the work of the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. And then the Caroline and Tanya and Anya and Andy are paid staff of the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. And some people work 0.8 and some people work 0.6, but it allows us to have across the province a team of wonderful people moving the work forth. And so what is the Alberta Mentoring Partnership? And so our work started about 20 years ago. And the intent was then and still is to increase the number of mentors in kids' lives across Alberta. And one of the reasons that we're having this session today is because we know that not all children who are referred for mentors get a mentor, because there are so many young people that are referred, and there are not as many people stepping forward. And I don't say that with criticism, because Alberta per capita is doing better than anybody else in Canada. And so while we need to continue to do better, we're really proud of the citizens of this province and of our provincial government and those people that serve as part of the Alberta Mentoring Partnership from community organizations and institutions across the province, because we do have many citizens who play this role, but we need more. And one of the things that we have been talking about is, if you can imagine a continuum, and that continuum perhaps on the far right-hand side might be our children in care, and making sure that every one of those kids in care who wants a mentor has access to a mentor. And then if you go to the other end of the continuum, and you might have at that end of the continuum young people who could benefit from additional adult support in their lives, but more on a preventative end. And so one of the things we've been asking ourselves is, are there natural supports that exist in our neighborhoods and in our children's lives and in our families' lives that we could be bringing forth and having them become involved in the lives of our kids without being on that formal mentoring side of the equation for our children who perhaps need more supports. So today, Nancy and Suzanne are going to talk to us about this important work that they've been doing around natural supports, and we collectively will think about how might natural supports fit within our strategic plan for the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. I also want you to know that right now, there is a partner survey going on, and Carolyn would be really happy if those people that are on this call today that are part of the Alberta Mentoring Partnership were to complete that survey. As well, Carolyn would like us all to know that if any of us participating today are not members, we would really encourage you to become members. It's free. And all you need to do is go to albertamentors.ca. And then one of the staff that we talked about earlier will be happy to reach out to you. So through the webinar this morning, please know that this is about our collective conversation. We're looking for your guidance and your wisdom, and we're also looking for you to be part of the conversation. So in terms of the work of of Suzanne and the work of Nancy. Both have been involved in the work of creating communities of hope and opportunity and inspiration for our citizens for many years. Nancy's the managing partner of Sterling Lifestyle Solutions, where she focuses on areas of early childhood development, youth and mental health, well-being, and public policy. Nancy was the, from 2003 to 2012, was in executive leadership roles in health and children's services of the Alberta government. And she served as the inaugural president and CEO of the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research, which today you would know as PolicyWise. In addition to her management practice, she is currently a faculty member of the Max Bell Public Policy Training Institute. Nancy's been in that role since 2008, and she has been a mentor for the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions Brain Builders project. She and Dr. Tuff are currently completing a policy fellowship that was awarded to them by the Max Bell Foundation, the Burns Memorial Fund, in order to advance resiliency and relational networks for our vulnerable kids through natural supports. Nancy has also been an active volunteer for over 30 years in the community. She has served on many boards, locally and nationally. And she is currently the board chair of Canadian Mental Health Association for Edmonton. She is also on the National Institute of Families for Child and Youth Mental Health, called Family Smart. I'm also proud to tell you she's a member of my board of directors at Boys and Girls Big Brothers Big Sisters in Edmonton. And Nancy is also a member of the board of the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. So lots of knowledge, lots of wisdom, lots of years, lots of opportunity for us to learn from. So Nancy, thanks for being here today.
I'm going to jump in really quickly with one housekeeping item that I missed. Sorry. I just wanted to let everyone know that we're recording the webinar today because we want to be able to share it afterwards with anyone who wasn't able to attend in person. So we would love you to have your video on and be part of the conversation. But if that's an issue for you, please just turn your video off for the webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Rochelle, very much. Suzanne Tuff is a professor with the Department of Pediatrics and Community Health Sciences in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. And Suzanne is also a Max Bell Foundation Burns Memorial Fund Policy Fellow. She's the principal investigator of the All of Our Babies Families cohort of over 3,200 mother-child pairs followed since pregnancy through adolescence. And the overall vision of the research team is to investigate the relative impacts of the social and genetic environments on maternal child health to inform decision-making, program planning, and policy. Suzanne has been recognized through a number of awards, including a Global YMCA Women of Vision Award, an Alumni Award of Excellence, the Jeffrey C. Robinson Award from the Canadian Pediatric Society, and recently the United Nations She Innovates Initiative. Suzanne and Nancy, we're just so pleased that you could give us the time today to be with us for the next couple of hours on this important discussion regarding natural support. So over to you both.
Thanks so much, Liz. Great to be with everyone this morning. I'm going to attempt to share the screen. We'll hope this works.
There it is.
It's not wanting to go to my, from the beginning.
Nancy, do you want?
Ah, there we go.
Okay, thank you.
Should do it. There we go. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tanya, for the land acknowledgement. And congratulations on what sounds like a new role and a very important role with the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. And Rochelle, it's been very nice to see you again. I haven't seen you in a long time. And Liz, that was a very nice introduction, very long. What it really tells you is that I'm really old. So that's the biggest thing you get out of that. But Suzanne and I are very pleased to be here to talk to you today. As Liz mentioned, our work has been funded by the Max Bell Foundation and the Burns Memorial Fund. We started out with a 2-year fellowship. We're now in, I think, year 4, and it has been extended because of the amount of interest in the work, actually, and the uptake. And we are funded through until July to do this work. And Suzanne and I are really looking to pass the baton on this work. We're looking for champions, people like Liz, who has been a clear champion. We're hoping AMP broadly will be a champion for some of this work and many others. I noticed a few of you signing in. Somebody was from an FRN. We have done a presentation to the FRNs and are hoping to continue that conversation as well. So we're really looking at extending this work into the community and looking for champions to uptake the knowledge and to move forward with it in ways that Suzanne and I cannot do. We're not the on the ground people. You guys are the ones who are on the ground, working with people on a day-to-day basis, working with children, working with families, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. So looking forward to the conversation later this morning. I also should acknowledge the University of Calgary and the Awerco Center in particular, who came alongside and funded a chunk of this work as well. And our 2 project members that were with us for the first 2 years, Jessica Walsh and Mark Agius, we would not have been able to do what we did without them. So just to acknowledge them as well. To remind you, the objectives for the session today is really to learn a little bit more about natural supports and to explore how using a natural supports approach could augment and potentially strengthen mentoring in Alberta. And I think Liz spoke to that nicely in her opening comments as well. Just so you know what the day is going to look like, we're already on to the presentation piece, right on time and on schedule. As Suzanne and I are going to try and get a lot of information into half an hour. We're going to give about 10 minutes for Q&A. As Rochelle mentioned, please put your questions into chat or comments into chat as you go along. Even if we don't get to all the questions, we will ask to have the chat after sent to us. And if there's any particular questions that we think could be answered subsequently that are important to get to, we'll get those answers back to you after the session. We're going to have a very brief stretch break and then come back to get an introduction to the breakout session. You're going to have a breakout conversation for about 20 minutes and then come back and do a fairly brief report back. And then we'd like to have a plenary discussion around what it would take to move to action. And then Caroline will wind up with some closing remarks and a wrap up. So that's the agenda for the next hour and 45 minutes. So just in terms of a bit of background, I wanted to just speak quickly to the Calgary Change Collective and the work that they did around working with vulnerable youth to enhance their natural supports. And the link is here to their practice framework. Some of you may be familiar with this work, others may not be, but this is a project that actually has been almost a decade in its development. And when Liz talked about the continuum, sort of from that prevention side of the equation through to youth, vulnerable youth and intervention with individual children and youth, potentially even in the child welfare side of the equation, this is the work that the Calgary Change Collective initiated. When Suzanne and I began our process, one of the things that we did was we met with a number of youth and families that had been involved with the Change Collective in Calgary. We also met with some youth and families that were connected to Big Sisters, Big Brothers, or Boys and Girls Club particularly, in Edmonton. And we talked to them a bit about what their experience was around natural supports, obviously with the group in Calgary having had very specific engagement in a natural support strategy. the conversations with people in Edmonton was a little more, had to orient them a little bit more on what was natural supports, but it's not a particularly complex concept for people to get their heads around. And also important to note that we noted that any Indigenous families that we talked with totally understood what it was right off the top, didn't need any description. It's a very natural way of thinking and being in Indigenous communities. And I think we have much wisdom to gain from Indigenous communities moving forward on this agenda. Anyway, to a person, all of the youth, the vulnerable youth in particular, said, you know, it would have been so much better if we had known about natural supports when we were younger. If we'd had some of them earlier in our lives, we might never have run into the difficulties we ran into. The families felt that the natural supports had made a huge difference for the children. But one of the things we heard from families, particularly in Edmonton, was that actually they'd like opportunities to be more engaged with their communities and have more natural supports. So what we heard from everybody was that this idea of moving more upstream and getting more into the prevention side of the equation was really a worthwhile strategy, and something that certainly youth and families were both very supportive of. So I would encourage you to take a look at this if this client group fits your group. And there are certainly those that could provide you more detail or some training in relation to the practice framework if you were interested in that. We're not going to talk about that today. We're really going to get upstream, but keep that in your thinking when you think about this continuum. It's a very important part of it. So what we were doing with this fellowship was really, we were working on identifying policy opportunities. That's what our work was about. Policy opportunities that would enhance natural supports in the community, particularly for those that were potentially vulnerable. And we chose to deal specifically with children in their middle years, 6 to 16. We all have slightly different definitions of the middle years, but that's what we chose to use. Because there's a great deal of work that goes on between 0 and 6, a lot of early childhood work, and there seemed to be a lot of work happening with vulnerable youth, more typically on the older edge side of the equation. We really felt that that 6 to 16 was a critically important group to be the target of our work. This does not mean that natural supports at a community level don't have relevance across all age groups, actually, not just of children, but of adults as well. But the focus of our work was on the middle years. So what are natural supports? Well, the definition's a pretty standard definition. There are these informal but reciprocal connections, and that's one of the things that's really important, is they're the reciprocal connections. There is as much benefit to a natural support to the receiver as there is the giver. So these are mutually beneficial relationships. And in particular, they can be close relationships with family, friends. They could be a relationship with, say, a formal mentor through the Big Brothers Big Sisters organizations, or it could be these broader associations, which are neighbors in organizations, or even potentially local businesses. Why did we think natural supports mattered in the middle years? Well, we looked at a lot of data, and if you go onto our website, there's no end of data actually around the middle years and some of the things that we're seeing. But these were a couple of important data pieces that we thought really spoke to why it was important in the middle years. And I will note that all of our work, the first 2 years of our work, was all pre-pandemic. And so on our website, you will see that we've, in a few places, we have some reflections on how the pandemic may have impacted the work. We would say, if anything, as a result of the pandemic and some of the challenges that children and families have had in many communities, and particularly those that are more vulnerable, if anything, this work is even more important than it was at the time we did it initially. So why is it important to build a naturally supportive community? Well, you know, we want to promote resilience. We all believe that social integration and social cohesion is important. And all of this leads to healthy behaviors and development. We know that natural supports can help do that. At a community level, really important to increase that sense of belonging, cohesion, and we believe that natural supports really are essential to building a civil society. How do natural supports really differ from at the level of family, child, and community. I'm going to, at this point, turn this over to Suzanne, and she'll take you through the next few points on the PowerPoint.
Great, thanks to be here today, everybody. It's wonderful
Suzanne,
to be
can
able
I
to
just
have.
ask you, do you want me to advance this for you?
Yes, go. Well, actually, just in a second, Nancy. I'll just
Tell me
set
when.
a bit of context. Okay, sounds good. It's great to be here today to share our work, and I just want to echo what Nancy said around the pandemic, highlighting that much of what we've learned in this project is not only as or more important right now, but it's as or more feasible than ever before because people are in their neighborhoods in ways they weren't 3 years ago. So that makes this work both timely and exciting. And just another preemptive comment. It's hard to summarize 2 years of research in the 6 minutes that has been allocated to this important presentation, because really it's about the conversation that we're going to have. But I would encourage anybody that wants more details on the highlights of the tour that I'm going to present today to either put it in the chat, connect with me directly, or go to our website. So with that, I'll just go back to what Nancy was framing around how do natural supports differ at the level of the child, family, and community. And we'll go to the first slide here that illustrates that in a stable setting, the child thrives with a balance of support from family, community, and society. And I'm not going to say anything about our work that you won't already know. Really, what the research does is quantify what we all experience in real life. So this is what we long for, is a healthy child thriving in the midst of family, community, and society. Now, it's often the case, and typically the case, that children experience some kind of adversity. And on the next slide here, we can see what happens when the adversity surrounds the child and there is limited support from family, community, and society. So the adversity really impacts the ability of the child to reach their true potential. Part of this is because the child's stress response is activated. That impacts the ability for more complex thinking and long-term learning. Partly, adversity limits the ability of the child to engage in skill development that can help them transcend adversity. And there's a number of other examples that I'm sure you're aware of in your own work and lived experience. So too much adversity is really limiting the ability of the child to thrive. If, as we see on the next slide, there are some buffers against the adversity that include the family but are not solely the family, and they engage with the community and society, we can demonstrate that the child is able to thrive in the midst of adversity, or certainly able to navigate life well enough to develop skills that will enable them to be a prosperous adult. And this is really the part of natural supports, as you'll see on the next slide, that animates the work that we're called to do right now. So communities include all of the resources in the physical environment around us, as well as in the social and interactive environment around us. And Nancy highlighted that we can conceptualize community as those informal interactions that really just enable us to keep our emotional resources available for when we really need them, when there's a threatening circumstance. So if you don't have to use all of your emotional currency, just navigating your way through school and your social relationships and an unstable home environment, you have more ability to cope with challenges. And also, especially as we're talking about children in this context, to protect some resources for learning and development of both life skills and relational skills. So that's kind of the Coles Notes version of why natural supports has really animated what we're doing now. And so now I'll shift to 3 or 4, well, 5 slides on the evidence that kind of gives more data around why we believe this to be so true, that again, I encourage you, if you're interested in more information, check out our website. So we did 6, is there one before this, Nancy, maybe? We did six kinds of evidence review. We looked for that one, yeah. We looked for a number of kinds of evidence to inform our strategy. And every time we began to dig into Albertan information more in depth, we came to a new level of understanding about how things happen in our neighborhoods. So the first thing we did was a rapid review of understanding the role of natural supports in advancing life skills for children and youth. We used a number of methods in this project, and we were able to identify key characteristics of strategies that worked. We then looked at whether or not we could quantify policy and program recommendations for community-based programs that aligned with what we knew helped children. And here we were able to find that there's been considerable evidence around how we help individuals survive, but not really as much evidence on how we help families and communities thrive. We then tested out our information to date, looking at family perceptions of natural supports in Alberta communities, finding out how Albertans used their communities, what services they enjoyed, what services they didn't use, and why they didn't use them. We then tried to quantify the ability of Albertan families to access resources by looking at community newsletters and websites to see whether neighborhoods of different levels of vulnerability had access through their newsletter and website to activities in the neighborhood that would bring people out to be together. And I'll just fast forward to this one, and you won't be surprised that the more vulnerable the neighborhood, the less likely they were to advertise what was available. We then did an environmental scan of the perceptions and practices of community-based natural support. So we interviewed a number of community organization leaders and a number of community-based social workers to find out what they recommend in terms of enhancing natural supports in their neighborhoods. And we then did an evaluation of community perceptions of social connectedness and support to figure out what Albertans want in their neighborhood. Next slide, please, Nancy. So fast forward through our years of research, and our key findings are not going to be a surprise, but of course we need strategies to share information about safety and perceptions of neighborhood safety. There's often a disconnect between the absolute quantifiable level of risk in a neighborhood and what neighbors perceive as the level of risk. We need to better understand the role of community and community associations in terms of facilitating the development of naturally supportive environments. And a good example of this is many community associations do not have service to their citizens as part of their vision. They have facility rental and structural supports as part of their main objective. There was an opportunity to formalize coordination and have community leaders who are responsible for sort of this intersection between program management and neighborhood engagement. And it was important to have specific strategy considerations, such as a broad range of partners with a shared vision, and building on existing resources, particularly those resources that are not often thought of as relevant to children 6 to 16, such as small business. So next slide, please, Nancy. Oh, maybe, I think there's one before this. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to you.
Sorry, do you want the one that was earlier?
Well,
this one.
So yeah, perfect. So sorry about this. So anyway, what we're summarizing in terms of evidence is that there is less evidence around strategies that address the well-being of families and communities, and the quality of that evidence is lower. And there is evidence about strategies that improve individual well-being, and this you'd be very familiar with in the kind of work that you're doing. And so I think I'm going to pass it over to Nancy now for the next stage.
Thanks, Suzanne. Suzanne, I'm going to just mention none of the chat's actually showing up on my screen when I've got my screen open. So if there are any questions, maybe you could let me know as I get going here.
Sounds great. I'm on it.
If anybody had questions, I'm not ignoring you. I just can't read it. So you will have received a copy of our infographic. This contains some of those data points we talked about. We felt it was really important that there was something that was just an easy one-pager for people to be able to share with others if you want to have a conversation about natural support. So we would encourage you, this is on our website, and I will share the information about our website towards the end of the presentation. But we would encourage you to print this off, share it with people. We think that it can be useful in helping people understand why this is important, but also to think about what it is that they can do. And so at the very bottom, a few very simple ideas, simple strategies that can be done in a community that actually can help create a more naturally supportive community. We think things like that, the data, just coming back to the data point again, you know, when you look at an increase in 1 year of 15 to 29% of children who say they have no important adults in their lives, that's a really significant and worrisome piece of data. You know, some might look at it and say, well, 29% isn't that bad. The real issue here is the increase, which is huge, and 30% is still a large number of children. So part of the community safety piece that we also think is a very useful part of this conversation is this point that we make in the middle that you know, children with one or more supportive adults are half as likely to participate in risky behaviors, one of which is some of the substance abuse, violence, some of those issues that actually create problems within a community. So it's also important to help businesses understand why it's important to be contributing to a positive, a naturally supportive community. So how can you help your communities become more naturally supportive? Those of you that are working within communities, there's a whole section within our website on what you can do, how communities can do this. What's really important is that this is an approach, a concept. Natural supports is not a program. And so what you want to try and do is to underpin work that's going on in the community within that natural supports thinking and build that into strategy. So it's not about implementing a natural supports program per se. We always tell people that the first thing to do is to really start with yourselves and think about who your own natural supports are, who's important to you, what makes the biggest difference in your life. If you've had a success in your life, who is it you share that with? But help people to think about it on an individual level. And then to begin the conversation at the community level. Who needs to begin that conversation? Could be anybody. It could be somebody who's the president of the community league or community association, depending on what you call it within your community. It could be a service delivery organization. It could be, say, a Boys and Girls Club in an area. There are any number of people who might be able to start the conversation. The key is to bring together the community leaders that can actually help to advance the concept and the strategy. We think there's tremendous opportunity for community associations and community leagues to actually look at, most of them are supposed to do a business plan every few years or a strategic plan to think about what they're doing in their communities. Great opportunity to have the conversation at the community level around how could they be more naturally supportive. And really important for organizations like those that all of you represent. And I noticed as people were signing in, we've got a huge range. I mean, we have people working in libraries. I have to say libraries, hugely important source, actually, great leadership at a community level, so great potential within libraries. You know, right through to those of you that are in more of a direct service delivery, almost intervention type of organization. It could be any of you. You could start the conversation within a community that you're working in or within your own community at home. We encourage people to really think outside the box and to bring organizations to the table that are typically not part of this conversation. We encourage people to think about how we could use seniors within the communities. There might be a seniors facility within your community? Is there an opportunity to make that connection? Some of you may have seen on CBC a few weeks ago, there was a clip about a Vancouver-based community organization that had developed a program that was connecting seniors with high school students, and they were assigned a senior to go and visit, obviously in a socially distant way, which is easier to do in Vancouver than it would have been here, because I think that was in February. It was still a bit cold, but nevertheless. And it had been a very positive experience for both. The kids were finding it hugely beneficial, feeling like they were really contributing, and the seniors were feeling very connected with what was happening in their community. Pretty simple thing to do. So on the website, there is a guide actually to how a community might go about using natural supports to underpin strategies and some of the things they might do. And so I would encourage you to go and take a look at that. I'm not going to go through the guide this morning. We don't have enough time to do that. And most important, that we get on to the conversation. But here's another really simple one, and you again will have received the infographic on social snacking. But this is an idea that many people have grabbed hold of and said, oh, now this is something really simple to do. It's a brief and informal interaction in a daily event. And we know that these brief positive interactions will help give a sense of happiness, some belonging, some identity. The picture here is of the school bus driver with a very friendly face and wave. Today, sadly, he would have a mask on, but you know, you can still, with the conversation, with sort of smiling eyes. I think Suzanne said we heard somewhere it was called smizing instead of smiling. I don't know. But you know, that positive interaction for that child, the difference that makes in the start to their day. They may have had a hairy beginning to their morning. They may have had a neighbor yelling at them for running across their grass. As soon as they have this positive interaction, it helps to diffuse that and put more positives into their day than some of the negatives that it may have started with. The same is true for all of us. And this is a place where businesses can really make a difference. We did a session last week before, that some of you may have signed in on, looking at natural supports from both the Change Collective's perspective and ours. And one of the other presenters, Pam Krause, who's been involved with the Change Collective work for some time, gave the example of how she goes to the same McDonald's every morning to get her coffee, drive-through, and that the woman knows her, recognizes her, and actually has this brief interaction with her every day. And Pam said that it's such a reaffirming thing for her. Just imagine if all of the drive-throughs, if drive-throughs had people that were intentionally social snacking and helping all of us get onto a more positive day. But this is the kind of thing that businesses can engage with, everyone in the community. It's not expensive. The one pager sort of tells you what it is you have to do, and you could readily think about how you could engage in the development of a strategy to advance social snacking and underpin some of your community social supports, or initiate work around community natural supports just through social snacking. We also developed, and this comes from the evidence. Suzanne talked to you about all of the evidence pieces that we did at the front end of this work. And out of that, we developed a set of indicators that could be used at the community level that would be an indication that the community was becoming more naturally supportive. These key indicators were actually shared with those that were submitting applications to become FRNs about a year and a half ago, whenever that process, I think it was about a year and a half ago. And as we heard the other day, FRNs have now been in existence for a year. But these were actually shared with the FRNs as possible examples of things they might use for community well-being. I don't know how many actually took those up in their work, but this was supported by Children's Services to say, these all make sense, and yes, these things actually fit as good ideas and indicators that would show work and progress towards improved community well-being, which was part of the underpinning of the well-being and resiliency framework. So these indicators are again offered to help. Always important to give people examples, and when you look at these indicators, it's easier to think of the example of what the action might be based on these indicators. And these, again, as I said, all of these are rooted in the evidence and the information that was gathered at the front end of the project. So obviously, I said this was much about public policy, so we need to get public policy action. Important to note that we think that action is actually needed at all levels of government. This is not about any one level of government, but there are some slightly different things that can happen in each level of government. I mentioned earlier the importance of the wisdom that's within Indigenous communities. I will say that Suzanne and I did not do any work on specific communities at all. We kept it at a very broad generic level, but in our recommendations, we have said that we think this is a really important a group to engage further in the conversation because we think there's much to learn from Indigenous communities. But you will not see it within our work. We could not do everything in the 2-year horizon that we had to do this project. We think municipal governments are critically important, provincial obviously, and we think the federal government has a role, and we have had some interest from the Public Health Agency of Canada. The key is that whatever is done, we believe it requires collective action to catalyze it. It cannot happen at any one level in any one organization. Wherever the work is happening in natural supports, it really needs that collective action. And so a group that comes together like the Alberta Mentoring Partnership is really an example of a group that could take collective action to advance natural supports. Just a few examples of some of the things that have happened to date. There was the practice framework that was developed by the Change Collective, and this is reflected in a number of the policy pieces and practice pieces within the Children's Ministry. The Ministry of Children's Services also funded the Middle Years Out of School Time Natural Supports Project, which has about another year to go, and it's specifically looking at how natural supports could augment some innovation within out of school time to be able to provide more out of school time. Part of the opportunity of natural supports, it's not about letting government off the hook, it's not about trying to decrease funding, but it is about expanding capacity. And when we look to communities, we've got a huge amount of asset within our communities that are untapped in terms of our work, trying to help children and families be better supported, build resiliency, and get more positive outcomes for kids. In Calgary, the Community Health and Addiction Community Strategy Action Plan, on the prevention side of the equation, you will see natural supports referenced in there around a number of strategies. And the Calgary Council of Champions has committed to doing, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but they're going to do some sort of a social snacking strategy, which we're quite excited about. I mentioned, of course, the well-being and resiliency framework. Natural supports is not specified within the well-being and resiliency framework. However, it sets the foundation for it because it reflects in many places, the importance of social supports and of social cohesion. And I will also mention the civil society agenda, which is, of course, a cross-ministry initiative. There's a Premier's Council on civil society. We think that's a tremendous opportunity to try and advance some of the work in natural supports more broadly across Alberta, connected with that group. We know also that there are policy enablers, and I didn't want to focus too much on these. We know that there are barriers and there are some enablers that are going to be needed at a public policy level. In particular, one of the first questions that often comes up are the issues of safety, looking at insurance, liability, and there's concerns both for those receiving and those that would be offering natural support. So on both sides of the equation, we need to think about this. How do we get people back feeling comfortable with interacting with children or with families at their local level? How do we get people back volunteering without having to be tied up in knots? And how do we get community organizations to feel comfortable that they can work with others in the community who are emerging as the leaders within that community, but may not necessarily be a formal part of the organization. So we need some policy work around that, and we have initiated some conversations around that already. This whole use of community facilities, as Suzanne mentioned, many of the communities, their biggest purpose, the community organizations, is the rental of their facilities. How do we look at those as being assets for the community? Not assets in terms of financial assets, but rather a place where people can come, where they can look at implementing some of the ideas that they might have, really a point of social connection for the community. It was always the intent for community buildings, but not always the case anymore. And lastly, the other one that was identified is determining how to ensure that there would be funding for engagement coordinators or somebody of that ilk. While much of this can be done with volunteers at a community level, there has to be somebody who is supported to do some of this work, funded to do some of this work going forward. There are probably a number of others. Those are the key ones we've heard. I mentioned that there's a number of fellowship products. So our website is www.connectionsfirst.ca, and there are many different products on the website. I will tell you that we are in the process of getting actually another web person to just try and redo some of the navigation on the website, because it periodically is a bit challenging, but if you persevere, you will find it all. So, stay tuned for any of those changes. So with that, we have a few minutes for Q&As. Let me just stop the screen share here. There we go. So anything in chat, Suzanne?
Nothing in chat, just a comment that social snacking was part of somebody's training at Starbucks, and it was a vehicle for understanding, engaging with the community at Starbucks, but also for identifying people in emotional distress. And so just sort of validation that it's out there, people are being taught, it's successful, and a good example of a business that invested in it.
A great example. I mean, we know that there is lots of this work all over the place. We haven't necessarily, it's not necessarily called natural supports, but one of the things that we're hoping to accomplish with some of this work is to actually start to build some of that common language so that we're all talking about the same thing. We did a presentation for FCSSs across the province. When I looked at FCSS plans and strategies across the province, many of them had components that were absolutely natural supports pieces. But again, the language wasn't quite the same. There's an advantage to having common language and underpinning it with common evidence as a way of moving together as a collective. But it certainly doesn't mean that this is new or novel. It's really a way of pulling it together, attaching it to the brain science, attaching it to the other evidence pieces that we have, and being able to engage people more collectively around this kind of action. So any questions? That was a lot of material in a very short period of time.
Is the information that you provided, it's all on the website? Okay.
Pretty much, yes.
So if we want to implement some of these strategies in our community and we're having difficulty, is there someone that we can connect with?
For the next number of months, for sure, you can connect with probably me in terms of that community piece. Be very happy to do that. As I said, we are sort of dedicated to trying to help get some of this moving. And then I think once people have some other examples, it will be easier for people to jump off of it with other community work. So anything in the next number of months, by all means, connect with me. We hope to be able to actually, and this won't be work that Suzanne and I will do going forward, but we're hoping that Burns in particular, Burns Memorial Fund might keep doing this, is to put good examples onto the website so that in future people would be able to go and see who else is doing something around what that they might be able to learn from. So we're hoping that the website won't be this static thing that just sits there forever and a day, that rather it will be a bit of a live piece of work that people can add to and create some of those connections going forward. And I think that the foundation may well choose to do that. They are very committed to doing some ongoing work around natural supports, and that might be, I'm pretty sure that'll be one of the pieces they'll be willing to do.
Is it okay if I just share a story that just warmed my heart? And then I think it was a natural support that developed on its own. Is it okay?
For sure.
Okay, so there was my oldest son, he's 28. He had made a friend who's a bit older, and through this friend he would get work, and they decided together that they weren't going to drink, and they skateboard a lot. So they took in another younger individual, and they're Indigenous. They took in another younger individual, and then I just found out that the three of them have taken in another younger male individual who likes to skateboard. So they've created this group, and they just kind of welcome people into it. They don't drink. The two youngest are on a skateboard team. They've been sponsored. And the youngest, he was always himself, and they don't know what his family background is, but they've kind of become his family. And it just like gives me goosebumps, because the two oldest who've been together for years, they said, we want these boys to know, like, they don't have to drink. They don't have to get into that lifestyle. And like, I was so happy I cried, because they did it all on their own.
It's a wonderful example. And, I mean, that is what the human species is about, right? That is how we want to do that. That's a really lovely example. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's always helpful when we can illustrate what we're doing with examples as well. I think that, the thing that, one of the things that we hope happens with natural supports is that they will be continued over time. These aren't things that necessarily have a 6-month or a 1-year or a 2-year horizon. You look for these natural supports that can be continued through the life course. And those boys, I bet, will stay friends, throughout the decades. And they may not be best friends, and they might move to other places, but my bet is they'll stay connected, and they will be supports for one another. And that's part of what we think is so important about moving to natural supports, and really encouraging those kinds of relationships that aren't dependent on a program or a service delivery organization, that they do grow organically within the community, and then hopefully are sustained over the long period of time. Great example. Thank you so much for sharing.
Just like to echo Nancy's comments. It is totally heartwarming, and it brings everything alive that we all know to be true about the value of relationships, the value of intergenerational mentorship, the value of developing a skill that then enables you to not be seduced by poor behavior or poor habits. I mean, Jessica, it has everything about this body of work.
As I stood up, I just to stretch, I thought, oh my God, I didn't mention schools. And it's probably just because, of course, one just automatically assumes schools are part of the process, but I didn't mention it specifically. And schools, I think, have a very important role, obviously, in looking at building more naturally supportive communities. Not necessarily as leaders, again, it might be as contributors. It might be that there's spaces within schools, because community buildings are, we would hope, we all keep trying to have schools be more available. It's another one of those policy questions, but spaces available in schools more readily as community gathering places. But certainly as we looked at the middle years, schools were extremely important places. Even things like community gardens in school grounds, and the things that you can use school grounds for. So there's no end of opportunity within schools. And to those of you that are associated with education, my apologies for not specifically mentioning it. As I say, it was my miss, not because we don't think it's really important. So there we go. So with that, just to introduce the breakout session, So I'm actually not going to go back to my screen share at the moment. I'm just going to read this. So we thought it might be useful to just reflect a little bit before we go into breakout as to how a natural supports approach can be used within mentoring. And I'm sure it's already embedded in the concept of mentoring. But how could you align it within the AMP strategic plan? And I think Caroline shared the strategic plan with those that may have not seen it yet. And you know, within the strategic plan, you know, there's this collective responsibility is a very clear terminology, being responsive to changing needs. And of course, we know now we've got significantly changing needs. We have no idea what we might really be facing in a pandemic echo. There may be some good news and there may be some not so good news, and we're not 100% sure what that impact is going to be, but we need to be aware and be sensitive of it. Also, that AMP would focus on developing new and innovative approaches through a renewed focus, partly building resiliency and supporting youth transitioning into adulthood. I think, again, natural supports really fits within that whole framing. If you look at the pillars, the goals within the pillars, particularly the strengthening Alberta's mentoring network, which is enhancing partner engagement. And I would say part of that is thinking about new and innovative partners that you may not have worked with before, trying to get them to the table, and aligning with other initiatives within community and area or within the province. And then in expanding and enhancing mentoring, this whole idea of supporting transition, engaging natural supports and non-traditional mentors in that process. So those are just a few of the highlights that show up in the Alberta Mentoring Strategic Plan. So what are the questions for the breakout? You have 20 minutes for the breakout. And I'm just going to move us to, so this is your question. What are the opportunities and what could it look like within your organization, within your community, or within the province? And try and reflect on all of those, but probably most importantly, within your organization. So this is the conversation for the next 20 minutes. Think about this in terms of the work that you're doing related to mentoring, but also the other work you might be doing in your organization related to children and youth. Reflect a bit on families. Is there a way you could help advance natural supports for families? We think it's actually, at one point, Suzanne and I were going to focus our whole project on building more natural supports for families because it just seemed so critical and an area that was not always well talked about. But reflect on families, and I know many of you do that anyway. And then, as I say, to think about it at that broader community level and provincial level. So you have 20 minutes to have that conversation. Andrew is going to work his magic and break everybody into totally randomly selected groups. You've got a great opportunity here with people from all over the province, all corners, and from so many different organizations. So I hope you have a very rich conversation, and we'll come back together. I want to give you a 20 minutes, so we'll come back together at 11:30 and try and designate one person in your group who could come up with sort of the one or two best opportunities that you identified within your group. I would also encourage you to not lose the other things that are talked about. If somebody would kindly record, that would be great, and you could take a picture of it and send it back into Caroline. Otherwise, just try and capture those keynotes, but report back will be two things. So that, Andrew, can you break everyone into their groups, please? Back. Andrew, at the end, did we have 8 groups?
Yes, we did.
Okay, good. What I neglected to tell everybody was to pay attention to what group you're in, because we need to report back according to group. So hopefully somebody in your group knows which group you're in. And so I'm going to just start with group number 1. Does somebody know that they were group number 1?
I think we were group number 1.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think a lot of us already kind of spoke about how we already use natural supports in our respective organizations, and how we are working to incorporate it even more so moving forward, and how COVID was a real hindrance to natural supports and the programming we offered. I think the biggest theme, I guess, in our conversations was having how to let other people know, or how to let clients know the natural supports that are available to them, and not just relying, I guess, on one agency or one support system, but connecting with clients and connecting to the natural supports in the community, and not just being the sole provider of natural supports, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent. Excellent. And I think that's really, we think that's a really important component, you know, that it becomes that true, more natural process, right? And that it doesn't have to be headed or led by a service organization, that people begin to do it more naturally. I think for us, that's what success would look like. You know, if sort of 10 years from now, it was just something that happened, and people knew about it. Thanks, Mona, that's great. Group 2.
I believe that was our group. And so kind of 2 different things that we chatted about was how social snacking, how we can kind of use that in connecting and working with other agencies in our communities, and how we can come together to possibly create a space for the social snacking, and then therefore encouraging stronger natural supports. Again, Starbucks came up as a great possible partnership or connection that we can kind of use as a space, or, you know, work together to encourage this social snacking. And then again, just how we use our space to encourage the natural supports to then share with our families that we work with. For example, I work at Boys and Girls Clubs, so using the club space as an environment that everyone can come together and support each other. So different families coming together, and then just kind of building those relationships. And again, through the social snacking. So I hope I kind of summarized our conversation well. It was a really great chat. So that's kind of what I have for group 2.
Good, great. Thanks, Monique. I think the other thing with the social snacking is that it is an opportunity also to share that very little bit of the brain science with people, you know? So some of it is also helping people understand what's behind it. You know, there actually is a physiological reason to do this, you know, not just because it's a nice thing to do. And so it's also an opportunity that you have to help give people additional information about how they impact one another, understanding what's important to those healthy relationships. So great, thank you. Group 3. Jeanette, you're on mute.
It was our group, but Jessica, I think, was the recorder.
Jessica, are you out there?
There'd be a separate recorder and a separate speaker. Oops. Okay. We talked about the kind of the same as what was said before, about how there's already natural supports in place, and it's just a matter of identifying them and strengthening them. And we talked about Vanessa works with Big Boys and Girls Club and Big Brothers Big Sisters, and they have an area that they share with the ground is in the same vicinity as an elementary school, so she has the opportunity when she's bringing stuff in to have those social snacking moments with parents and children. And we Tasca, I think is her name, she works with international clients, And so we talked about how to build natural supports there with just, there's friendship programs which match families with students or people from out of the area that don't have those natural supports, family, friendships. So they have the opportunity to get to connect with someone on a deeper level. And if I forgot anything, please let me know, team. We talked about how COVID has really affected the ability to build those natural supports as well. And not everybody has access to computers. So even though there's tons of online opportunities right now, not everybody has access to them.
Yeah.
And we talked about in the past, before COVID, how there was always a hub of a community. And that's where people would build those connections, but we don't have that right now.
Yeah.
If I missed anything, guys, just jump in.
Looks like they think you got it all. So that's great. Thank you, Jessica. An important one to think about, those new families coming in, and that is what is always the effort, is to create some of those natural supports for those families. But thinking about how that even then gets extended right over time and builds into more and more natural supports, because often the families that might be supporting some of those families aren't in the same community either. So how do you create that community connection? It's a really another really important piece. It's so good to hear about all of the work that is going on around natural supports, and really just thinking about how to extend this and move that conversation right to some other places. So the next group is group 4, which I was in on. So it's Veronica.
Nancy was very nice to gear us towards the conversation. I was a bit lost before we started, but after we started talking, I understood very well what it entailed. So we talked, well, the points I gathered was 3 points in general: how we as an organization help with this natural support, or use natural support to support our clients or our participants and things like that. So examples were given on how we did intergenerational activities, how we do some senior programs and things like that. So that's in most of our organizations. We don't know that we're already doing these things, but from the programs and services we offer, we realize that yes, these things are actually done. It's how we can move forward and get more out there. So this natural support will be available for everyone or everybody that needs it. So we also talked about how we can leverage on community associations within our community, how we can get out there to, give that natural support. And of course, examples, we also talked about how programs are taken into the community rather than just in the organizations that provide these programs. We also, Nancy mentioned how we can leverage on businesses, how not just for funding, but for, like everyone has already said, the social snacking, just to get that community together, build that one big happy family, to know that there's this support out there for everyone. So those are the 3 points that I think we touched on in our group. But if I'm missing anything, I know Nancy is going to talk to.
Great job, Veronica. Well done. And she was voluntold, so, which a few others might be feeling like they were voluntold. So thank you, Veronica. That's great. Group 5, the one other piece was the service club specifically. So we had the pleasure of having somebody with us from Ottawa, Steve from Ottawa. And he said, make sure you remember service clubs. And I think that is important, actually. We sometimes forget service clubs, and they're a really important source and a good bridge into that corporate business community within the community as well. But we had some lovely examples of natural support. So group 5.
That was my group. So something that we were talking about, I'm sure, is a sentiment shared by most of the people here, that the pandemic really got in the way of, if we were doing a good job of working together, for example, like the library, Boys and Girls Club, the schools, they've all worked together in the past on something in Edmonton called Wakotowin Night, which is an Indigenous family sort of feast, activities, something that it's one of those you don't really know what you have until it's gone sort of situations where like we all participated in that and we all valued that in some way. And then not having that the last year really shows just how integral that was. And I'm sure that this is something that everyone's feeling, that when everything's on Zoom or we can't have people in our spaces or reduced capacity, it just means that it's just that much harder to connect with the youth and with the families. So something that we thought in terms of opportunities and going forward is it's really important for a lot of those youth to be able to recognize those supports that are around them, but they might not have the language or the vernacular to understand that you know, auntie down the street or the person at Boys and Girls Club is that person that can support them. So maybe what we really need to do, if we haven't already, is build some skills and strategies for how those youth can kind of learn that common language, advocate for themselves and those agencies as well, so that everyone's sort of on the same page. Because I think in the past, we've had some groups and some agencies that are really amazing at it, and others where they might have great services, but we just don't know they exist or whatever's happening. So it's kind of getting everyone on that same page, sharing that common language so that those youth can either recognize what they already have, or they can go and ask for it if it's something that they really need help with. I think that's mostly it.
Great. That's a great point and an important opportunity going forward. And I would say the same thing is true for families. For families, they need to understand. When I met with a number of families, it was shocking how many families said they didn't know anybody in their neighborhood that they could go to if they needed help. And if they needed help, they might go to the Boys and Girls Club where their child was going after school, but that they didn't actually have a neighbor that they knew well enough. So, you know, I think it's that kind of connectiveness that we need to have within community and help people realize that even families, how they can reach out and start to build and create some of those natural supports, particularly for those that are new to Canada or new to a community. Really an important piece. If you can't ask for it, sometimes it's hard to get. So knowing what you're trying to do is important. Great. Group number 6.
That was our group. And a lot of what we talked about has been mentioned before. So I think what really stood out in our group is that idea of intentionality. While we may know about natural supports, and how are we really intentional about bringing that into our organizations and into our communities? So thinking about that, we talked about the idea of creating opportunities for those social connections. And some people, you know, some communities don't have a lot of those. So how can our organizations help in creating those opportunities and bringing people together so that they, you know, can form some of those relationships or natural supports? And then similar to what Jennifer was talking about in group 5 around that skill development. And even when you create those opportunities, some people naturally know how to go and strike up a conversation with somebody that they don't know, others not so much. And similarly with our youth. So how do we teach both our youth those skills to go and talk to somebody that they might do as being supportive, but the adult may not know that. So how do we help teach them as well as adults that idea of skill development? And then Suzanne was in our group and she had a really good point about that idea of social snacking. And if you say hi and somebody doesn't say hi back, we need to let people know not to take that personally because we don't know if then they're going to say hi to the next person and kind of pass it on. So those were sort of the key pieces that we talked about.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Good. Group 7.
Group 7. So we were talking about what was interesting was the concept of natural supports. While it's existed for so long, in this last year for all of us, this is when we became aware, or at least put a name to what we were doing in our work. And so with that, we were talking about within our specific organizations, like now we're the torch carriers. So I think as an organization, each one of us, as we have more of these conversations and we're becoming more aware of the terms, our responsibility is to continue to educate others and bring that knowledge forth. I can think of how much it's blown up in this last year. Before this year, I haven't ever met Suzanne or Nancy, but, I've ran into them so many times. So this is great that we're able to take this knowledge and be able to share it. A couple conversations about how, as well, within our organizations, how we used to have the ability to have people come in and find those natural supports, those bridging ties with other community members, and those existed. But, because of the pandemic, our social circles have gotten a lot smaller. So, we see Margarita shared it in Tabor that, it's the staff that are the network. And we certainly see it within our Edmonton clubs and the Boys and Girls Clubs, where parents are going to the staff and they're recognizing them as that support network, and they're asking for that help. And so it's supporting our staff and being able to be that natural support and giving them that information and that knowledge of, how to help be that bridge and then also be that support, and then also finding their own support, because, the stories being shared, we're not always ready for, we're aware of. Other cool things that, for instance, Margarita shared another thing, like they were putting up chalk, little tiny things that, it's that social snacking. They're putting chalk up on fence posts, inviting people to leave messages, and encouraging them to actually leave them out front of people who are on the spectrum of older, and leaving little positive messages on the sidewalk as they're leaving their doors, going for walks. So those little tiny things of social snacking have been really beneficial in this pandemic world.
Great, thanks, Ian. We did see, and one of the things Suzanne and I have talked about often is that while the pandemic has made all this more difficult, we've also seen some wonderful examples and some great creativity around how people are still trying to support one another. And the other thing that we really hope will happen is that will continue at the community level. I don't know how many of you that are, particularly those of you that are in the city, I'm sure when we used to go for a walk, sometimes people would say hi. More often than not, no, everybody just crosses. Through the pandemic, people actually will make a point of saying, hi, good afternoon. And we want to make sure that continues too, and we don't lose those kinds of things. So the chalk one is lovely. I like that one. And so last but not least, group 8.
Good morning, Nancy. I was voluntold. I'm Peter Peterson. My group was Mohammed, Petra, and Tawa. And we talked about what all y'all talked about. So putting it in maybe a different context. So let's assume that Alberta used to be a care-filled place when it was on First Nations land. It's how people got to be where they are today for 25,000 plus years. And then when there was Western expansion, let's assume that people came to Alberta and found caring there. And then with the some of the shifts in media and marketing, and let's say that people shifted to care less, where you had to take care of your biology, your adopted children. Other people's children were important, but not as important as yours, which came in with some of the Western beliefs. So once we woke up to that we had become careless, we programmatized our world to be careful. We needed to be careful with other people's children. We needed to be careful with our lives. We needed not to be sued. We needed not to do harm, make sure that our interventions were appropriate. I think what we're looking for, as Ian said earlier, is to return to a place where we are more care-filled. And it's a natural progression, I think, of human systems, at least around the world. When new refugees come to our country, come to Alberta, I think oftentimes they've left a care-filled place, and they're a little surprised at how hard it is as an individual to find care-filled others to reweave themselves into the fabric of humanity, but most importantly into Alberta, into Canada, and into its local community. And so we talked about the importance of having a meaningful, a memorable, a measurable, and a manageable way to show people what it means to be care-filled. And it needs to be, it needs to handle the complexity that we all live and work within. And it needs to rely first on the self-agency of the individual. We need to do something to weave ourselves into the web of life, but we also need the other to have agency returned. And as you mentioned, Nancy, earlier, it needs to be reciprocal. We talk a lot about transactional exchanges, hopefully in a natural mentoring context, becoming transformational, not only to the youth that you're mentoring, but to you. The fact that we mentor because I have the opportunity to be changed. And the older I get, the more transformation I need. So that's a little bit of what we talked about. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this, Nancy.
Great, thanks, Derek. So we've got 4 M's. I love the 4 M's. The measure in there is a really important one that we think about going forward. And a nice concept of care-filled versus being overly careful, and finding that balance again. So thanks for that, Derek. So we are.
Nancy, can I just add a comment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the feedback has been great. And I think I just want to go back to some of the core content that Nancy and I were sharing, and that's been part of the transition from the evidence to the application. And one of the things that all of the feedback has led me to want to comment on is we all know about the benefits of these relationships, but many of the groups talked about the skills to make the new relationship outside of the organization that's the hub. So things like the families you're serving, how are we helping them learn how to make a new friend or learn how to normalize their experience? Because many of the families that are vulnerable have very similar experiences to other vulnerable families. And I think part of the natural supports and social snacking is to use these resources as an anchor, but it's to develop the ability to move away from the resource as the natural support. And so one of the clearest examples that we've had in our group is whenever one of your families has a big celebration, they're not celebrating with their resource worker, they're celebrating with their family, friends, and community. So how do we help them have more of the skills to engage with new friends and new communities? So I think I'll pause there because there's lots of ways we can teach people how to make a new friend, but just to keep that in your mind when you're thinking of the value of the social snacking and the natural supports.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we technically 5 minutes left, and I know Caroline wants to make some comments on wrap up and next steps. And what we wanted to talk about as a large group was some of the ideas around what it would take to move some of these other ideas or to broaden the work you're already doing. What would it take to move it to action? I think Suzanne has already suggested some of the pieces, and we've heard this from others, but there is an important opportunity for some training of some size, shape, or description, a way of preparing people to help to do this more effectively, knowing the language, knowing what the evidence is, but also giving some mechanism. And so, Caroline, I guess my question is, do we have a couple of minutes just to hear if people have some thoughts on what it would take to move to action, or alternatively, if people would take some time and submit those ideas to you following the conclusion today and letting you do a good wrap up?
Nancy, why don't we take a couple of minutes to start that, and then we can kind of get that conversation going. And then if people want to send in their ideas, that would be great. But at least if we kind of get it started, people will might it might start some ideas.
Okay, so we'll take a few minutes. What would it take to move to action? You as an individual, your organization, what are some of the things that we need to move this further into action? Jessica.
Hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. What someone had said about teaching skills on how to like talk with people, and I never really thought of that, but like with one of my families, we discuss interactions they've had during the day that they felt were negative, and just even explaining to them that it's not personal. And then when you go, like if you go to a doctor's appointment with them and you model positive communication or conflict resolution, things like that, and just explaining to them that some people just have different personalities, some people have different ways of communicating, and then that way they don't take it personally and they don't react in a negative way. They're able to react in a more positive way because they're more understanding and empathetic of the other person. I think that's one thing that's really important is to teach them by showing them, and just by explaining in a way that isn't condescending, that doesn't talk down to them, things like that. I think that's really important for some people.
Right, for sure. And the flip side of that, of course, is helping them see what the positives were, right? So not just what were the problematic interactions, but what were the positive ones and what made them positive, right? Sort of that it's the balancing those two that I think would be important. Thanks, Jessica, that's great. Other thoughts, what would it take to move to more action, continued action, broader action?
I think one way of approaching this, in the group that I was in, we talked a lot about just trying to be aware of what's going on in the community. And so I think actually like reaching out to the people that you are aware of doing this kind of work in your service area and saying, look, this is really something we're trying to become more intentional about. Where do you see us being able to partner on that? And do you know anyone else who's interested in that? And having those like really clear discussions using that shared language that you're talking about and the usefulness of that shared language, I think then makes it so that when someone from agency A knows that one of their clients is looking for something, oh, I had a conversation with this person from agency B, I'm going to just send them a message and see if they know anything. And I think that really direct communication can help kind of affect some of that change.
Yeah. So helping to enable connectivity, but being very aware of who else there is. One of the things we talked about a bit in the group I was in, which I haven't emphasized a great deal, but it is a critical piece, is that every community has its own unique context. And so really knowing the community and understanding the community that you're working within, what are the assets? Who are there? Who can you connect people to? Who can you connect with? Is really, really important. And we often tend to stay fairly connected with other service providers, and thinking a bit broader on that map, who else is out there that might be able to do this or help solve a problem or be a connector for a family. So really important that helping make those connections, hugely important. Other thoughts?
Nancy, just building on that, I think the importance of understanding your community, not only who are the connectors, but where are sort of those connection hubs, right? So it's as important sometimes to know the who as the where.
Yes.
And who you can reach out to. And I think the other piece is that common language. And the more we get around that common language for people to begin to grasp and have those conversations, I think will be really important too. I mean, it's great to hear some of the little pieces that have come out of this. I mean, social snacking is now taking up, sort of that renowned, it's become something in our languaging. But again, what does that mean for other people? And so whenever we're introducing it, how are we introducing it? And then I love the 4 M's, and I love the care, full versus the care filled. And so how do we make that part of our common language?
Thanks.
Great.
Nancy,
thanks, Tracy.
Nancy, some people are going to have to go or have to leave, so maybe we can just do a wrap up. And as Nancy said, I put my email in the chat. So if people want to send their ideas in, that would be great. Or even the summaries of what you discussed in your groups, because there were some really wonderful ideas and we'd like to be able to capture those. So just as I close, Andy is going to put up a bit of a poll. So these really help us as we look at moving forward with our work and finding out what other people are wanting or interested in. But I really just want to thank Nancy and Suzanne, first of all, for the work that you're doing and how important it is. And as it came out clearly today, how important it is, particularly right now. And also for sharing all of the information with us and getting that conversation started. So I was really excited to hear all the great ideas about what people are already doing and where they think they need to go next. And would love to hear more about it. Again, if you want to send in an email. And again, just to reiterate that if you are a partner of AMP, if you have not already received our check-in survey, you will shortly, just to get some more information about what we can do moving forward to help your organizations. And if you are not a partner with Alberta Mentoring Partnership and would like to be, please go to the website and it's very easy to sign up. And lastly, just wanted to leave everybody with a little bit of a call to action. I really liked what Ian's group talked about around it's our responsibility to carry the torch and take this knowledge and share it and think about how we can provide and create those opportunities for those social connections for our youth and our families to be able to connect with the people around them and not be so reliant necessarily on other community resources or agencies. While they're still important, I think everybody is stretched there too. So what can we do to create those connections with natural supports and to continue being social snackers and teaching others around us how to do the same thing. So thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate your participation and look forward to seeing you at future webinars. So thanks again, and yeah, have a great rest of the day.